Brilliant. Thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it, both in person and online. I'm just going to quickly share my slides. It is a bit weird doing this inaugural lecture when you've been somewhere for 6 years, because it feels like you're, I don't know, you're kind of telling people what they do already know about you. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit. So I am gonna talk about the research that I've done, but I also want to talk about this idea about making identity abuse part of the definition of domestic abuse. And in education, we're asked to think of more and more of different kinds of way of assessing people and using self-assessment as a tool to help students to kind of think about what makes a good piece of work, or what meets the assessment criteria. So I read my work yesterday, and I have to say I didn't do very well, because when I look at my title, I don't think that's really what I'm talking about. That I think what I'm talking about is maybe a bit more radical than I put in my title. So if I was marking myself, I would say could do better there with that title. But we'll see how I do. That's not working, so let me find another way. So I always want to give thanks and to credit people that I've worked with around domestic abuse and LGBT lives and relationships. And these are key people that I've worked with in the 20 odd years now that I've been researching in this area. All of them have been key to the work that I've done. So, and later on, there'll be mention of Gitanjali and Ayesha Gill and other colleagues in the department with the work that I've done around family abuse. But big thanks and credit to these people. And then I just want to say a little bit about me. So I've been doing this work since about 2004, and I've started and I've tried to maintain a position that is feminist and intersectional. And that really means that I understand domestic abuse as being based on power and control. And that that is the central dynamic that we have to try and understand and unpack when we're thinking about how can we make sense of domestic abuse and how can we address it, both in terms of providing support to victim survivors and when we're trying to think about how can we intervene and challenge the behaviour of people who cause harm or perpetrators. So in the first piece of work that I did with Marianne Hester, what we did was, for the first time really, ever, anywhere, we compared love and violence in what we called then same-sex relationships and heterosexual relationships. And when we were looking at that, we did a survey and we did interviews and we did some focus groups. And when we were making sense of the data, we had these three questions really that we wanted to answer. Why don't LGBT people recognise domestic abuse and name it as such? Why don't practitioners recognise LGBT plus domestic abuse? And
sorry,
that's okay.
There's a couple more people.
Very nice to see you.
Sorry.
Thank
you. There are more people coming.
Okay, thank you. And what's love got? That's going to be a bit annoying, isn't it? So on the next slide, it's quite busy, and I don't want to go into this too much because I know if you're familiar with the work, you will this will be familiar to you. But our answers to those questions were, first of all, so there is a kind of feminist success story about domestic abuse, and feminist activism, scholarship, lobbying, political lobbying have successfully transformed domestic abuse from being seen as a private problem, something that happens in the privacy of your own home, and transforming that to being a serious public problem that the state and the institutions of the state should pay attention to. One of the unintended outcomes of that success is what we call the public story of domestic abuse. So This is that we understand domestic abuse to be a problem of heterosexual cisgender men for heterosexual cisgender women, a problem primarily of physical violence, and a problem particularly of a particular presentation of gender. So the big, strong man being physically violent towards a small, weak woman. And then later in my work with Rebecca Barnes, we kind of unpacked that public story a bit more and kind of thought about the binaries that the public story reproduces. So man, woman, perpetrator, victim, masculinity, femininity, active, passive, strong, weak, and that those binaries really have an impact, not just for those people who are impacted by domestic abuse, who are heterosexual and cisgender, because they don't necessarily see themselves in this public story either. But for LGBT plus people, they not only don't see themselves in it, but often practitioners find it hard to hear the story, because if two women are in a relationship, then if they're kind of understood to be passive, weak, feminine, then it's quite difficult for practitioners to think, okay, so which one of these two women is the perpetrator and which one of these is the victim survivor? Because we assume that women, in general terms, aren't aggressive, and that therefore any conflict or abuse that might be taking place is not of any concern, that they're not going to be able to cause each other real harm, and that it might just be what we might dismiss as a cat fight. And if it's two men, then men are born to be aggressive. They're socialized into being aggressive. They know how to fight. They know how to defend themselves. So again, whilst we might say the harm could be seen to be a potential, the risk is seen in different ways because men can defend themselves. And so again, there's this idea that it's an equal fight in some ways. And that has real impact for how LGBT plus people understand themselves, but also how practitioners understand them. And often same-sex domestic abuse is understood to be mutual abuse, or in North America, it's called bidirectional violence. Partly, I think, because of the impact of this kind of heteronormative, cis-heteronormative, gendered understanding of domestic abuse. So that's one of the answers to why people don't recognise it. So we talked about relationship rules to try and get away from a heteronormative way of understanding abuse dynamics, and thought about how we could make sense of what the accounts were. Oh, of course you can come in. Definitely. Oh, it's lovely to see you. And what we found evidence is that there are two rules in an abusive relationship. One, the relationship is for the abusive partner, so it's on their terms. They make all the key decisions, even if a key decision is that they don't take responsibility for anything. They are setting the terms for the relationship. And the other rule is that the victim survivor is responsible for everything. The relationship, the abuse, the abusive partner, children if they have them, the home if they share one. And that's really, hello. And that's really important, because in that kind of construction of what a victim is, we have kind of ideas that victims are passive. And most domestic violence, victim survivors of domestic violence don't see themselves as passive or weak, because they are managing everything. And they often, in our research, feel sorry for the perpetrator, feel themselves to be emotionally stronger than the perpetrator, because they're taking the responsibility for what's happening in the relationship. And also this third aspect, when we looked at what love means in abusive relationships, then abusive partners disclose why they behave the way that they do. And victim survivors can tell you why their abusive partners behave the way they do. And it is a tale of childhood abuse or substance abuse, or nobody understands them, or any number of reasons that are not necessarily not real, but they also are given in the context of a loving relationship that can result in victim survivors feeling very empathetic and wanting to protect and remain loyal to the abusive partner and to help them to change because they promise to change. They're very good at making declarations of love at key moments when victim survivors might threaten to leave. And then they promise to change. So love is a really important part of domestically abusive relationships, or if not love, positive feelings, attraction, desire, a hope for a long-term relationship, a hope for forever relationships, and that those kind of ideas, very culturally normative, are very powerful in domestically abusive relationships. So as a result of that, I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is the change to the Duluth power and control wheel that we made. We put the relationship rules in the middle and we had practices of love to kind of show how important it is to understand that survivors have feelings, positive feelings about their abusive partners, and that has to be understood when you're trying to offer help and support to people. And also we put around the rim intersecting identities, because the way that people make sense of their lives is the result of the identities through which they live their lives. So we have to keep those in mind when we're thinking about how people make sense of what is happening, how they make sense of when they might seek help and who they might seek help from, and how they can think or consider leaving an abusive relationship. In the Coral project, because we were interested, this is the work I did with Rebecca, we changed the wheel again because of this argument that people in same-sex relationships are more likely to be mutually abusive. There's students walking past the door now, so they're just, now they're banging on the door. So I just wanted to sec. Lucy's gone outside, thank you to Lucy. So yeah, so we wanted to kind of really unpack whether this might be the case, that people in same-sex relationships are more likely to report mutual abuse or bidirectional violence. We didn't find any evidence for that, but we did find evidence of people describing how they fought back. Sometimes that was physical, but sometimes it was emotional or verbal. And that what they were trying to do was to re-establish some sort of equality in the relationship by not allowing the perpetrator to get away with their behaviours. So we called this space for reaction, that they were creating spaces for reaction, which might include help seeking as a way of resisting and trying to make change in the relationship to prevent or resist or call out the abuse. So, days, just go back a bit. I'm coming at this as an intersectional feminist, but I'm a sociologist, so I'm really interested in social groups and how our society is structured in hierarchical ways, positioning different groups unequally in relation to each other. So the feminist approach to understanding domestic abuse has always positioned patriarchy as fundamental in positioning women as subordinate to men. And Sylvia Wolby's work has kind of identified these 7 systems by which women are subordinated to men in employment, in civic and political life, in the family, culturally, both morally and I would say pathologically, through sexuality and through male violence. And they argue that it's the threat and the actual abuse of men that maintains structural inequalities. So society produces the conditions in which women can be victimised with impunity. And the message from the criminal justice system is very poor. Very small numbers of women are, of perpetrators arrested. A smaller proportion are ever convicted and punished. So the message really is carry on. Carry on what you're doing. There is no consequence for the way that you're behaving. And then if we look at a queer approach, you can see similarly that LGBT plus people have also been structurally oppressed by society. They've been constructed as morally suspect, so threatening to the family, to children and young people. They've been constructed as pathological, as deviant biologically and psychologically, and we've been constructed as criminal So at various points in history, we have been medicalised, we have been criminalised, and we've been seen as outside of society morally, that we are deviant and threatening to society. Gay liberation started, let's say, in the 1970s, but the focus very much was then quite individual. So the right to come out, the right to live in a life as a gay man or a lesbian, as it was then. Bisexuals are kind of added, some would argue begrudgingly later, and then later again, trans people. And it's only really in the last 20 years that the British society has legislated in favour of recognising our relationships, and not just the right to be ourselves as a person, but also to have intimate relationships, to have sexual relationships, and to have family relationships, parenting relationships that can be recognised and protected by laws. And LGBT plus people are defined through LGBT people, particularly through our sexual attraction and our sexual behaviour. And that intersection of sexuality and gender leads also to stereotypes, which are held within LGBT plus communities as well. But obviously, it's the society that is creating these dominant ways of constructing our sexualities. And then this is really, really brief and a summary, and we could have a whole session on this in itself. But in brief, gay men are understood to be able to separate sex from love and to want to have open, anonymous, non-monogamous relationships or sexual encounters. Lesbians, in contrast, are understood to want emotion. So the big joke in the lesbian community is, you know, what do you do on the second date? You move in. So this kind of emotional importance, and in the psychological literature, especially in the 70s and 80s, there was talk of merging, that this was problematic for lesbians, that they merged with each other to the extent that they lost their identity. And they're not sexual. Bisexuals are constructed because they challenge the binary, then they are untrustworthy. They can't make up their mind, and that makes them disloyal. It makes them greedy, and therefore untrustworthy. And they also have a high sexual appetite. They must do if they want to have sex with both men and women. Trans people and non-binary gendered people are also untrustworthy because they also challenge the gender binary and can be objectified, and their bodies are exoticized and fetishized. So there's a story that can be told in society that LGBT plus people, that we live difficult, challenging, lonely lives, isolated lives, that we're conflicted by our identities, that we internalize oppression, and that can make us both, and if you believe the literature around minority stress, both vulnerable to abuse, but also it can make us become abusive. So you can tell a really depressing story about LGBT plus people's lives, not a story that I would want to tell myself. So when we're thinking about LGBT domestic abuse specifically, I want to talk about help seeking and help providing. And these are the perennial concerns that I think are there. And I'm going to try and find a way of proposing a solution. I was really disappointed because I was quite impressed that I had lots of P words here. And then the first one is definition, and I can't think of another one. Anyway, if anybody can, that would be good. So the definition of domestic abuse, I think, is concerning in some ways. The prevalence of LGBT domestic abuse, the privatisation of help seeking in LGBT lives, and the provision of services. So I'll just really quickly go through these. The definition of the Domestic Abuse Act has two parts to its definition: relationship contexts and the range of behaviours that make up domestic abuse. So it lists them. The relationship contexts include personal connection. So that means that if you're over 16, regardless of whether you share a household or a home, you can be in an intimate adult relationship, or a family relationship. So domestic abuse as it stands includes family abuse. And there's a big problem, I think, for LGBT young people or older people experiencing family abuse, because it's not clear where they can go for help and support outside the by and for sector, which we'll come on to. If we look at prevalence, the most robust survey that exists in Britain is the England and Wales Crime Survey. They don't ask about transgender identity. They did do a study, a kind of an analysis of the data that they had comparing lesbians, bisexual and heterosexual women. And lesbians and bisexual women are proportionately more likely to report what they call partner abuse. And bisexual women are 5 times more likely than heterosexual women to report sexual abuse. Yet, in international, national, or local policy, LGBT, that acronym is often just an add-on to VAUG, the VAUG agenda, the violence against women and girls agenda, and it's often not called the gender-based violence agenda. So even though these are concerning proportional rates, we aren't visible in debates about policy and strategy for dealing with this. And in some ways I get that, because the numbers are small. And obviously cis heterosexual women by far are the biggest numerically group who are victimised by domestic abuse. But my approach, if we're thinking about help seeking, is that anybody who is victimised, regardless of who they are, should be able to get a service. And I don't think that's necessarily happening. So then if we look at privatisation, most of the research that is there, whether it's in Britain or elsewhere, tells us that LGBT plus people rarely use mainstream or VAUG domestic abuse organisations. Obviously, this has become more problematic since the debates around gender and sex and the debates around single sex services. They're rarely using the police, and the only place where this is kind of different is in Manchester, because the Manchester police use a different way of recording domestic abuse, where they can flag LGBT people, but no other police force does that. So where they usually go in is counsellors, therapists, mental health services. So there's real privatisation of the problem, and there is also some evidence that LGBT people are reluctant to come forward because they feel that they will damage our reputation, damage the reputation of LGBT people by saying that our relationships are abusive. So there's some interesting things happening there. And then there's provision. Now, this is already out of date. We did this in 2021, a mapping for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office. And the one on the left is by and for services. So the LGBT Foundation in Manchester, Birmingham LGBT in Birmingham, why did I say that? And then this cluster of services around the southeast and London, some of whom have national remits. Oh, I don't know why that happened. Where's that gone? That's just jumped out. Hang on, let me just see if I can find it again. Maybe it's because okay. I want to resume. Yes, I do want to resume. Good. So yes, in the southeast, but Gallup has got a national helpline, and have recently got support workers that can work by telephone in different parts of the country, and the Naz and Mac Foundation that focus on particular kinds of family abuse. They also have a national helpline. But it's sparse. You can see nothing in Wales, nothing in the northeast, nothing in the southwest. On the right, then we used some criteria looking at kind of inclusive services, or a mainstream service that might have an LGBT specialist. And then you can see that the picture is slightly better. Llamad in South Wales, IDAS in the North Yorkshire, and Rise in Brighton, though I'm not sure that that is still there. If somebody online knows about that, then it would be good to hear from you. And of course, what isn't there is Loving Me, which is a trans by and for domestic abuse service that is based in Manchester, as well, and their remit is broader than Manchester. So the provision isn't great. So then I'm trying to think, so why is that? Why is that happening? Why is it that the by and for sector is really busy, but the mainstream sector for domestic abuse are not seeing LGBT survivors? And then I kind of get into a thing like, is it the same or is it different? Do we need specialist domestic abuse services for LGBT people, or should any service be able to offer a response that's respectful and appropriate? And there is a consensus that there is a lot of similarities across gender and sexuality, that people report experiencing sexual, physical, emotional, economic, psychological abuse. Coercive control is a characteristic in across domestic abuse, regardless of gender and sexuality. And in our work, it was clear that across gender and sexuality, abusive partners isolate their victim survivors and undermine the sense of self of the survivors. We'll come back to this idea of selfhood. And those writing or in practice who focus on LGBT plus domestic abuse always point to the big differences being around identity abuse. And these are just some of the examples of identity abuse. So threatening to out somebody, mocking somebody or undermining somebody's sense of being authentically gay or a woman or bisexual. Sexual abuse predicated on stereotypes about gay, lesbian sexuality, bisexuality, or fetishizing or exoticizing trans and non-binary bodies. So identity abuse can work in lots of different ways. So then I'm thinking, so how do we understand identity? And sociologically, there are two aspects to identity: social identity and then self-identity. So social identity is about how we are positioned in society, by society, by the state, by our history, by our biography. And it's reflected in our social group origins. So our social groups might include race, gender, social class, citizenship, age, ability, capacity, sexuality. And those social groups are positioned by the state historically and currently, so pre and post colonialism. We are legally positioned, as I was describing, for LGBT people, socially positioned, morally positioned, so that to the degree to which we're criminalized or given respect or status or being attributed as sinful or deviant, and also anatomical positioning, to the degree to which our bodies are pathologized or validated. All of that is reflected in stereotypes about behavior and attitudes, expectations. What are they like? What's that social group like? What are the stereotypes that we have about them? And about our expectations about their conformity, social groups' conformity to the social roles that we expect of them. And it's also reflected, obviously, in power and access to power and voice. So who speaks and also who is listened to. And then with self-identity, that can be about somebody in their own lives recognizing that they are different, that they are other and othered. So experiencing social inequalities, experiencing oppression, naming oppression, understanding and being part of the recognition that there are hierarchies of power that operate in society. Coming out, I don't just mean as gay or as trans, but as yourself, as a classed person, as a disabled person, as a raced person, that can be a political moment. So we talk about consciousness raising. And you might just come out to yourself in that sense of knowing yourself to be politically positioned in society, as well as to others. And it's reflected in our social practice, so how we behave, how we present ourselves, how we, what kind of lifestyle practices we engage with in our everyday lives, and also what our political practices are that might be based on common cause. And I don't mean party political, I mean, I think if you live as a trans woman today in society, that is an act of politics, because you are acting in and against, huge challenge to your right to exist. So you don't have to be political, you don't have to be on a picket line, you don't have to be in a campaign, you just have to be yourself, and that is political in itself. So those kind of political practices that are about community building and allyship can also be based on common cause. And it's reflected also in conformity to and creation of norms in minoritized communities. So we create our own norms as well of behavior or value or principle that that we expect others in our communities to conform to, and are not happy when they don't. Let me tell you, there's a lot of infighting within minoritized communities. Obviously, this is what happens. So there's kind of social identity and there's self-identity, and they obviously overlap and feed across each other. So coming back to domestically abusive behaviour then, I strongly feel that domestic abuse is about the targeting of a self, both politically and personally. So the obedience of relationship rules is very tied to people's sense of self, the responsibility the victim survivors take and have thrust upon them by abusive partners makes them aware of their own selfness, their selfhood, and often not in very good ways, because there's a lot of self-blame that goes on. Being isolated from others and being undermined, having your selfhood undermined, all of that can lead to a very precarious or contingent sense of self, a precarious or contingent sense of reality, and a lot of self-blame. There's also anger as well. People who are victimised in domestically abusive relationships are not just passive, nor are they weak. So there are other things going on. But I think that domestic abuse is really contains identity abuse at its core. So when we talk about physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, economic abuse, all of these behaviours can communicate identity abuse. And in the literature about LGBT domestic abuse, this is really clear. It's really talked about, it's really spoken about and focused on, where people's identities of gender and sexuality within the context of their other intersectional identities of culture and faith, race, class, age, capacity, able-bodiedness, all of these can be targeted by perpetrators in people's presentation of self. So what clothes they wear, what makeup they wear, what cultural artifacts they like, what music, what books, what hairstyle, what jewelry, what body decoration, what choice of media, what being out or not, what hormones, medication, treatment, adaptations are you allowed to use, and all of these can be controlled, all of these can be regulated, and all of these victim survivors can be punished around for not conforming to perpetrators' ideas or expectations about how somebody should present. And also in their roles or their priorities, how they're expected to, what they're expected to do around a shared home in relation to children if they have them, how, where and when they're expected to perform, or their availability for sex, their behaviours towards others, where jealousy is in the mix. That says her there, but I mean for all LGBT plus people. And there's social connectedness. This is another aspect of identity abuse. Don't go there, don't go to the scene. That's, you know, that's full of predators, that's full of people who just do drugs and alcohol all the time. We don't need to go there. We've just got each other. We've got a big love up here in this relationship. And of course, all of that is true. There is a lot of drugs. There is a lot of predatory behaviour on the scene, but it's also a source of potential friends and network and community. And if you're being cut off from those things, then that has a real impact on your sense of who you are. So socialising, whether you're employed or not, your degree to which you can be independent, act independently in the world and have autonomy, all of these things can be undermined by identity abuse. This is what we do. This is what gay men do. Why, you know, if you want to be gay, this is what we do. We have chemsex. This is how we behave. We have open relationships. So if you don't like that, you need to just, you know, wind your neck in. If you want to be gay, this is what we do. So there's a lot of ways in which people can be made to feel undermined in their sense of who they are by identity abuse. We also find evidence of what we called experiential power. Again, I think this happens in heterosexual relationships, but it hasn't been researched, where older people or with people who have more experience of relationships use that to say, again, this is what it's like. This is how you do intimacy. This is how you do a lesbian relationship. This is what it means to be bisexual. This is what it means to be a woman. This is how you should look. This is how you should walk. So that people are very manipulated, regulated, coerced about how things are. So people who are newly out, a lot of the time that can intersect with age, younger people. It doesn't have to. People come out at all ages, but you might be young in terms of your identities of sexuality and gender, are also structurally positioned to be abused by those who want to be able to say, this is what we do it this way. And then if you look at heterosexual cis women, I think identity abuse is at the centre of what happens to them as well. We just don't call it identity abuse. But again, survivors' identity as women is targeted, again, within the context of their other intersectional identities, but presentation of self. I've read stuff where women report that abusive partners tell them what to wear, do the shopping for their clothes, punish them for their skirt being too short, punish them for wearing too much or too little makeup or the wrong jewellery, punish them for not having the dinner on time on the table, punish them for particular kinds of perceived peccadillos in terms of sexual behaviour or jealousy in relation to other men, and their social connectedness, whether or not they're allowed to work, be out in the world, have autonomy, have independence, whether they are allowed to have connections with family or friends. A lot of stuff around using motherhood as a way of controlling, regulating, punishing, threatening to go to social services, to get their children taken off them. That's about their identities as a mother. So I think identity abuse, we could see it as crossing sexuality and gender. And it also underpins family abuse. This is the work that I've been doing with, oh, look at that, I've put Gitangeli, I put your first name instead of Gangoli, I'm so sorry. Something very personal there. Gitangeli. Yes, identity. Absolutely. Well, you would, wouldn't you? I'm really sorry about that. So families, parents, elders, faith leaders believe that children, and that I think increasingly means older children, adult children, are the possessions of their families. There's increasing structural dependence of children and young people on their families, that they should obey their parents, that girls and boys, women and men should conform to norms of gender and sexuality, again, in their presentation of self, in their identities and in their practices in relation to dating, friendship, marriage choice, divorce, reproduction, and that parents, elders, faith leaders have the right to regulate, enforce conformity and to punish or exorcise evil spirits, or to coerce into conversion therapy in order to save an adult child or a child's life from their non-conformity, from their deviancy, from their sin. So again, identity abuse, I think, underpins family abuse. So conclusions then, I think there needs to be a transformation of LGBT domestic abuse from being a private trouble to being a serious public concern. And I think we need to improve service delivery to LGBT plus victim survivors and perpetrators. And I think that domestic abuse perpetrators, whether it's intimate partner or family, target victim survivors' core sense of self. It is personal and political or structural, and it unmoors victim survivors from their realities through lies, manipulation, isolation. It targets people's presentation of self, their social practices, and their social connectedness. And that can be in physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, economic ways. Draws on stereotypes both from outside, from society, historically, and currently, and it draws on stereotypes from within minoritized communities. The example I've been using is, what are gay men like? What kind of sex do they like? So these are stereotypes that are maintained and sustained in minoritized communities. So I think we should include identity abuse in the definition of domestic abuse, and understand that identities are fundamental to how domestic abuse works, and also understand that abuse of people's identities is fundamental when we're considering how we can enable and support people to regain their sense of self when they have left a domestic abuse relationship or are considering leaving a domestic abuse relationship. Because identity abuse shapes what people think counts as domestic abuse. It shapes who people think they can turn to and who can be trusted. People of colour often don't phone the police because why would they? Particularly in some parts of the country. So not only because they're fearful of the response to them as victim survivors, but also because they're fearful of what will happen to the perpetrators from the police. Why perpetrators might be protected, what support systems exist for them, around them. Because a lot of the literature that kind of talks about informal help, if it's talking about cis heterosexual women, it's family. But with LGBT people, it's mostly friends. So understanding that is important. Understanding how abuse is made sense of by victim survivors and how shame and self-blame can confuse things for people. And finally, how abuse is made sense of by the help provider, because help providers, as all of us do, carry assumptions about different social groups in society. And we need to find a way of raising awareness about how those assumptions can shape how you respond to people. We know that the first response to somebody who's seeking help is crucial in whether they will get the help that they need. If they get a bad first response, they disappear, and it takes ages for them to come back out again, to seek help again. So really important that we start talking, I think, about identity abuse across the sector, intimate partner and family abuse, regardless of gender and sexuality. Thank you very much. That is the end. Oh, I should unshare.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. That was incredible.
How do we unshare?
We are going to take some questions. I'm going to just because we have a lot of people online as well, and I want them to also get a chance. What I'm going to do, if that's okay with you, Catherine, is to take a couple of questions from the room, and people can raise their hands as Matt is doing. And people online, if they could put their questions in the chat, that would be really helpful so that Nicole can coordinate the questions and read them out. So I'm going to start with the questions. We've got about 15 minutes. Matt, I saw your hand first, and I believe it's the first question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. I have an album by Donovan, 1968. It's a first name, and I have a book of Donovan, 20, whatever it was. What's I've got to do with it? But anyway, and I've also just read The Psychopath Test. And in that book, the author interviews the person who created the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. and talked about the inclusion of homosexuality and then its exclusion from that angle. But in the end, the discussion hinged on the question of how do you distinguish ordinary from the supposedly clinically kind of like problematic? And in reading your book, I was absolutely fascinated because you do mention there's somebody on page, whatever it is, that says, oh, my partner really controlled me. They wouldn't let me go out on the scene and meet new people. And then about 20 pages later, there's somebody else saying, oh, my partner was really horrible to me. They abused me because they kept on going out on the scene and meeting new people and neglecting me. And then a little bit later on, there was someone said, oh, my partner was abusive because they made me financially dependent on them. And then a few pages later, someone else was like, oh, my partner's really abusive. They basically became financially dependent on me and effectively exploited me. And it raised that really interesting question about if it's abusive to go out on the scene and meet new people to the neglect of your partner, but it's also abusive to tell your partner not to go out on the scene because you're neglecting your partner. In effect, the idea of a non-abusive relationship diminishes, and like in the psychopath test, the idea of the sort of acceptable range of human interaction such that it's not defined as pathological. And the DSM manuals now go up to 900 and something on the page. They've got 500 different pathologies. And I'm just thinking, and I thought your book, I was really fascinated, one of the best books I've read in a long time, because it just puts its finger on this issue, which is, have we created a situation where there's no such thing as a non-abusive relationship? If in effect, you can be abusive if you're too caring, controlling, or you can be abusive if you're not caring enough, in other words, you're neglectful. And it just makes me think, is that the society we have created? You critique at the end of that book the neoliberal culture in which everything is financialized, but the idea of the individual as someone who could, as soon as they enter any kind of controlling relationship with any other human being, moral or otherwise, it's abuse, and just leave me alone, not just do it for money. And it's like, is that not the neoliberal world we've created? I've got to the end of your book and I was like, wow, I'm scared now.
No, don't be scared. Don't be scared, Matt. Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think I would say that so the kinds of contrasts that you've given us there are, to me, suggests what I would argue, which is that abusive people use whatever works. So there isn't an objective list of trying to control where your partner goes is abusive. You might want to say that. Or going out is abusive in and of itself. It's absolutely relationship dependent and contextual. So it is whatever will work in that relationship. So in one relationship, saying to your partner, I'm just going to go out every Friday night because that's what I've always done and that's where I see all my mates. You can say a response to that could be brilliant because I can go out with my mates. It's not in and of itself an abusive act. So it's the context of the behavior and the motive behind it. And so the why are you doing that? Why are you saying that? And then it's the impact. What's the impact of what I'm doing on this person? So if there is no impact, then it's not abusive. If it then is part of a pattern of behaviours, that means that one person is controlling another by what they're doing or saying, then you can start to say that that's abuse. I don't think there are, I find it quite hard to say that there are psychopaths and that they are the people who are abusive. I think abusive behaviours rather than abusive people is what I'm interested in. I don't think you can say that is an abusive person. I would say the behaviours that they're using are abusive. So, because I think all of our behaviours are contextual, aren't they? And they kind of speak to as C. Wright Mills would argue, we're a product of our history and our biography. So, that is what shapes what's happening. And, if I think abusive partners are very clever, because they will try things. And if it doesn't work, they'll just try something else. It's about what will work in this relationship with this person that means that I can exert power here.
Brian says that you can cure them.
Sorry. Yeah. There might be more questions.
That's for another question and answer session, I think.
It's for your next inaugural. Are there any more questions from the room, Jen?
I was really interested in this concept of identity abuse that spoke to me, and I think, you know, really with Matt's thing, the identity in a healthy relationship, the behaviours are negotiated, protecting both people's identities in some way. Way back early,
Yes.
at the beginning of the slides, you had the two wheels.
Yes.
And the second wheel had something like responses or fight backs, or
Yeah.
I forgot what you called it.
Yeah.
Okay. Was it that you hadn't investigated that before that study? What I'm interested in is how many of those fight back things were about identity preservation. So as a response to identity abuse, were some of the ways of fighting back about identity preservation?
Yes, they are. Not always, but they are. Yeah, definitely. We didn't, what we didn't, in the first study, we asked people what happens when things go wrong in your relationship. So we were very much, although we asked people about what they had done, our focus was on what had happened to them. And that's who we interviewed, people that things had happened to. In the second study, we asked, what do you do when things go wrong? So we were interested in asking people, what do they do? And that meant that we could then explore this idea of, is there this thing of mutual abuse? Are people getting into kind of mutually aggressive relationships? And we just didn't find evidence for that. And so the fighting back could be around, because, you know, I'm trying to think of examples that'll kind of bring it to life a bit. So there were people who argued that so a man that I interviewed talked about how his partner, he was I think he was something like, he was in his early 30s when I interviewed him. He had never had any relationship at all in his life. And he had come out in his early 30s. And the first relationship he had was with a much younger man in his early 20s who'd had 5 relationships before. And this young man moved in on the second date. And in a year, the old man who I'm interviewing had run up £10,000 worth of debt. So he kind of talked me through what had happened, and we had some vignettes saying, you know, what in this situation, what's going on here? Has this ever happened to you? And it was about somebody fighting back, and he said, yes, I've done that. And then he talked about, you know, what had happened, and it was one of the occasions that it had happened that the abusive younger man would continually say, you're fat, old, you'll never get another boyfriend, which absolutely made him believe that this was the relationship that he could have. This was his one chance at a relationship, because in some gay male communities, youthfulness is everything and physical attraction is everything. So to say to somebody that you're old and fat is really undermining your sense of identity as a gay man. So, and he would fight back. He would, you know, they would physically get into a fight, and then it would blow over, and then the young man would make him spend extraordinary amounts of money to make up to him, and then it would happen again. So yes, identity abuse can be very much part of the reasons that you might fight back.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to take a couple of questions up from online, if that's okay, Nicole.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. There's lots of lovely comments for you in the chat. People really appreciating what you've had to say. And I know some people have heard bits of it before, but I think bringing it all together in that way just does add something extra, and people have really appreciated that online. I'm sure you'll look at the comments yourself afterwards. We've got quite a lot of questions. I'm just going to do the first 3 to make that fair, if that's okay. And the first one is kind of a 2-parter, so in a way there's only 2 questions. So first of all, Becky asks, what are the implications of this for sex education? And as the follow-on, Sahana asks, and for teaching and understanding consent.
Wow, really interesting questions. I mean, I think partly I would argue sex and relationships education, what a nightmare that can be, isn't it? Because it's not very good. Maybe since the mandatory, since it's been made mandatory, there are changes now, and we will be seeing better relationships and sex education. But I think a lot of what we need to be doing in that at the prevention level, because that's probably what we're talking about there, is the how do we encourage your children and young people to understand the importance of a self and understand that people have many kinds of different identities and that they all make up the person, and that each of those identities should be respected, and that they are parts of the whole. I think if teachers, they, or the people who deliver relationships and sex education, need to understand better maybe the importance of identities in speaking to children and young people, and how that is a fundamental aspect of their development into adulthood, is to kind of accommodate and come to terms with their sense of who they are, and that involves both. I suppose the important thing is to understand that identities are not just something that are chosen. And I think that is something that that has developed out of a kind of political tradition, that you come out into an identity and it's politicized as a result of consciousness raising in the broadest sense. But also identities are pushed onto you. It's about how other people also perceive you and make assumptions about what kind of person you are because of the identities that you're assumed to inhabit. So I think kind of having an awareness of that in sex and relationships education can also mean that children and young people understand that that becoming a self is an interactive thing, a relational thing, and that we need to kind of build strong sense of identities whilst understanding that external forces also shape our understanding of who we are, and that we're fighting against those perceptions as well as kind of inhabiting identities for ourselves. I'm not sure I said that very well, but I think that's all I'm going to say. I think there was another part to it that I haven't answered. What was the other part?
That was the two parts of it, but then the other question, which I'm going to read out, is from Emma, who asks, have we regressed since the 2010s?
Oh, flipping out. Flipping out, Emma.
They're all difficult questions. I haven't picked the hardest ones for you, Catherine.
I think you've just selected the really hard ones. Have we regressed? I mean, it's yes and no, isn't it? It's no, because we have got those pieces of legislation that we can hang on to as moments when a state acknowledges and recognises that that everybody should be able to exist and form loving relationships and families. So, that we have to hang on to that. It's regressed insofar as we are much more, the sex gender debate, the gender critical debate, that is really challenging debate for all of us. And I say challenging, that almost sounds too flip, because obviously it is affecting people's everyday lives. So it's not just a kind of abstract challenge, it's affecting everybody's lives. I kind of feel that we need to better understand. I look at Trump's America now, and the fact that the Stonewall Bar, which in kind of LGBT cultural history is the start of the LGBT, well, I suppose then it was called gay liberation. And who started it? Who started those riots were drag queens and trans people. And they've now, in the Stonewall Bar, next door to the Stonewall Bar, there is a national park, and they have removed the T from the naming of that monument to Stonewall. This is really frightening stuff, because it isn't just about trans people, it is about all of us. If they can do that, then who is next? And we know, for abortion and reproductive rights, they've come for those as well. We're living in very dangerous times. So I can see why you would think that we are regressing, but I'm kind of hoping that we will start to realise that unless we do form really strong alliances and coalitions around this, we need to go back to a kind of more politicised sense of collectivism rather than this divisive stuff, which the people in power love. They love it when we're fighting each other. So, yeah, I'm not sure that's an answer. It's a hope.
It's a good point to end, I think. To end on hope is always better than,
than despair.
Than despair. But thank you very much. We are out of time. So thank you very much. I'm speaking for you. I am sure you would welcome any questions directed to you through email. And I know people have put stuff in the chat. I'm sorry, everyone. We couldn't answer all the questions, but we probably, including those in the room, but we probably would need to be here at least another 2 hours. And
I know, that's the thing, isn't it?
that is the thing.
But if you want to email me and ask your question, and if, and I will look at the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you very much. I should have said in the beginning that this is part of our 60th birthday celebrations. And when I say our, I mean the departments, not me personally, but so it's quite a big thing for us to have you as part of it. We're really honored that you can come and speak as part of the 60th celebrations. It's such an important part of the
Thank you.
department.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody online.
Oh, look, there's some great things going on. Yeah. How do we do that? Oh, yeah.
I think